That is what Professor Irfan Habib is doing in his constant efforts to make it possible for individuals and societies to learn from history in order to chart a better course for the future. To understand this difference between actual facts and myths, we have Professor Irfan Habib here with us. I would like to say thank you to Sir for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Sir. I would like to invite Shailender, who is our first year student, to introduce Professor Irfan Habib. Over to you, Shailender.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone present here. Professor Irfan Habib is one of the most prominent historian of Indian history. Following the methodology of Marxist, he is notable for his solid position against Hindu and Islamic fundamentalism. After Professor Habib got back from Oxford, he joined AMU, Aligarh Muslim University. He was professor of history at Aligarh from 1969 to 1991. He is presently appointed as Professor Emeritus at the Department of History of the AMU, Aligarh Muslim University. Professor Habib delivered the Radhakrishnan Lecture at Oxford in 1991. He is an elected corresponding fellow of British Royal Historical Society since 1997. Professor Habib has worked on the historical geography of ancient India, the history of Indian technology, medieval administrative and economic history, colonialism and its impact on India, and historiography. He was chairman of the Center for Advanced Studies, Aligarh Muslim University from 1975 to 1977 and 1984 to 1994. He was chairman of the Indian Council of Historical Research during 1986 and 1990. He was the General Secretary, Sectional President, and afterward the General President of the Indian History Congress 1981. He has authored various books, including Essays in Indian History Towards a Marxist Perception 1995, The Economic History of Medieval India, A Survey 2001, Medieval India, The History of a Civilization 2008, India Studies in the History of an Idea, and has co-edited UNESCO History of Civilization of Central Asia, Volume 5th, Development in Contrast from the 16th to the mid-19th century, The Cambridge Economic History of India, Volume 1st, 1200 to 76. First is Agrarian System of Mughal India. And Professor Habib has been honored with Watmel Prize of American Historical Association 1982, mutually with Tapan Rai Chaudhary, Padma Bhushan 2005, Ibn Sina Memorial Lecture 2009, Ibn Sina Academy of Medieval Medicine and Sciences, and Yash Bharti 2016. Thank you, sir, for coming to speak on our podium. Thank you so much, sir. Forwarding back to Dia.
Thank you, Shailender. Now I would like to invite our teacher in charge, Mr. Ashwini Shankar, to give a formal welcome to sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Professor Irfan Habib, members of professorial community, colleagues, friends, and my dear students. It is a rare moment of great delight for us to have Professor Irfan Habib speak today. On this profound occasion, I consider myself extremely humbled to introduce him to this gathering. I, in fact, must confess that it is too tall a task for me to even speak a few words of honor for a colossal scholar of his stature and repute. Let's introduce him to a congregation such as ours. It is so because just a mere mention of his name in itself is considered emblematic of exemplary learning and impeccable scholarship. Nonetheless, since the contingencies of the occasion demand a formal introduction, I, however, shall attempt a lame effort at it. Trained as a scholar of medieval times with special focus on Mughal history, Professor Habib received his early education at Aligarh Muslim University and later went to University of Oxford to earn a doctoral research degree. His monograph titled Agrarian System of Mughal India, published in 1963, not only marked a significant departure in the domain of Mughal historiography, but also in effect heralded a virtual paradigm shift in the very attitude, approaches, and the methods of reading and writing history in the country. It shall not be an exaggeration to suggest, therefore, that the said text represented both a watermark and a milestone of an indelible occasion in historical scholarship in India. Over more than half a century since the arrival of Ever, it is obvious and natural that there is but rarely a field in Indian history and its associated sub-disciplines that have not engaged the critical attention of Professor Habib's untiring scholarship. His oeuvre, therefore, includes numerous consequential books apart from innumerable important research articles on themes ranging from pre-modern economic and social history, history of technology, historical geography, political and administrative history, early Indian economy and society, anti-colonial resistance, historiography, intellectual and religious history, West Asian and Central Asian history, archaeology, capitalism, imperialism, socialism, to language and writing of contemporary times. To name a few, there are respective atlases of both the Mughal Empire and that of ancient Indian history, essays in Indian history towards a Marxist perception, the economic history of medieval India, a survey, medieval India, the study of a civilization, and many more. He has also been a co-editor of the reputed the Cambridge Economic History of India. In fact, Vedas and Vedic Age too has been the recipient of Professor Habib's intellectual engagements. In an illustrious and prolonged academic career, Professor Habib has served at renowned institutions, foremost among them being the Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, in various capacities, both as an academic and also in other positions of academic administrative responsibilities. Presently, too, he holds the decorated position of Professor Emeritus at the same university. In 1997, he was elected a corresponding fellow of the British Royal Historical Society. He has also served as coordinator or chairman of the Center of Advanced Studies, Aligarh Muslim University. He has been the chairman of Indian Council of Historical Research during 1986 to 1990, as the student said, and has also held the position of General Secretary, Sectional President, and then the General President of Indian History Congress in 1981. In 1991, he had delivered the highly distinguished Radhakrishnan Lecture at Oxford. For committed scholarship and excellence, Professor Habib has been conferred with many prestigious awards such as Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowships in 1968, Watermal Prize of American Historical Association in 1982, Padma Bhushan in 2005, Honorary Doctorate by University of Calicut in 2010, and Yash Bharti Award in 2016. Friends, we live in times critical where with great impunity, conflation of myth and history is being done on a quotidian basis for limited and nefarious ends. In words different, mythologization of history is not only doing incalculable damage to the scientific pursuit of knowledge, but is also simultaneously doing great disservice to the idea of a pluralist and accommodative society. Professor Habib, as a conscientious citizen and committed public intellectual, has been in the forefront in contesting this mischievous and dangerous tendency. Now it shall be the most prudent of me to request him to kindly speak to us on this much pertinent theme, myth and history, and thereby educate us today. But before I hand over to Professor Habib and invite him, let me also say that this edition of Origin coincides with International Women's Day today. So I take the liberty to wish you all a very happy Women's Day and welcome Professor Irfan Habib once again today. Welcome you, sir. I now invite you to deliver this edition of Origin lecture on myth and history. Over to Professor Irfan Habib. Sir, your mic is not on. Ajaji.
I'm very sorry about this. Friends, members of the college, I'm very grateful and informed, in fact overwhelmed with the kind words that have been said about me. It makes, of course, my task more difficult because I may not be able to render through this lecture the high expectations that may have been entertained about me. But I shall try to do my best and present to you, before you, what I can say on the whole issue of myth and history insofar as it relates to our country's past. As far as myth is concerned, the word is explained in a well-known dictionary as the traditional narrative, usually involving supernatural or fancied persons and embodying popular ideas on natural or social phenomena. One would like to perhaps shorten the definition by saying that myth relates to unhistorical facts that are popularly held or sought to be popularly held. By its very definition, myth is not history. That is to say, it does not offer facts that are true, but facts that are believed or sought to be so spread as to be accepted in popular perceptions. By its very definition, the extent to which mythology prevails in a society perhaps indicates its backwardness. Because any society must frame its objectives based on the correct memory of the past, the correct memory of what happened. Just as an individual, if he has a totally false memory of his own past actions and past experiences, would be almost endangering himself and others. So also a nation or a country with a wrong appraisal of its past, which of course the myth applies, the word myth applies, would be endangering its present and future conduct. Therefore, I think it's a very wise step to resist myth making. It would be a very wise step for any nation to resist myth making and to establish a correct memory of its past through what should be accurate history. In fact, history is the direct opposite of mythology. this science itself has developed over perhaps 2.5 millennia in different civilizations, notably, as far as we know, for the first time in the Greek and Chinese civilizations. The history established itself with Herodotus, particularly in Greece in 6th century BC, as an established branch of knowledge.
मुझे बहुत आता, बहुत काटा पीटी की है, प्लीज लगी।
History is generally a narrative of the past, and in pursuit of it, you have to establish two particular ways in recording the past. First, accuracy, and second, scope. Accuracy is concerned, among modern historians, and of course I take 19th century to belong to the modern period.
नहीं ऐसे नहीं।
Von Ranke, the German historian, established rules for criticism of sources, distinguishing between primary and secondary sources, the primary sources being those closest to the time and event, and therefore establishing norms for dealing with sources from which we obtain facts. Subsequently, Louis Namier, who died in 1960, particularly emphasized the use of, as far as possible, private documents, which would enable us to go beyond public proclamations and investigate private and personal interests. In other words, sources have to be studied and judged for their accuracy, as also the interests of the recorder, the objectives of the recorder. At the same time as the critical spirit in judging historical sources has been particularly developed, there has been a larger and larger scope of historiography. It's very pertinent that today is Women's Day because, for example, women's history now occupies a larger amount of attention of historians, or should so occupy, than was the case only 30 or 40 years ago. And much earlier, of course, with Adam Smith, but especially Karl Marx, economic and social history, or the history of what might be called the masses and their material being, that has been included in the scope of history. And so also environment, ecological history, what has often been called comprehensive history. So the scope of history has been greatly enlarged, while the methodology for establishing accurate assessment of facts, and of course the weightage to be given to various kinds of facts, has been increasingly sharp. In other words, mythology false but popular narratives have retreated, and factual narratives and historical narratives, both as far as accuracy is concerned, and second, as far as scope is concerned, taking into consideration the events and developments affecting the large masses of people, the largest masses of people possible, that have all been improved throughout the world. As against this, you have myth building often simultaneously takes place to various degrees, which a particular vision of the past, a particular depiction of the past is encouraged, not because it is true, not because it is, one might say, historically established, but because it will support one's own political or other objectives. And therefore, myth building, which was previously confined to religions, sometimes to tribal and traditional community feelings, now tends to become a political weapon. It has been a political weapon for quite some time. As we used to say 50 or 60 years ago, the communal interpretations of history on both Hindu and Muslim sides indulged in quite a lot of myth building, which could be then countered only by history. Today, we are seeing in India a very massive amount of myth building, which is being encouraged from official sources. And it is this kind of myth building to which I propose to concern myself mainly. Most cultures in the world, especially when their literary history begins early, the Chinese, Greek, Roman, Indian, Iranian, they had stories and tales, and narratives which were either based on religion, or is on China as tradition, literary tradition, which presented depictions of the past involving gods, goddesses, demons, and even monotheistic tradition from beginning with Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They had visions of the past which had little to do with reality, but were strongly believed in for religious reasons or for cultural reasons, and so on. So mythologies were created. And sometimes persons actually sincerely believed in that mythology. For example, in Islamic cultures like Arab and Iranian, world histories or general histories included descriptions of the biblical prophets as if they were history. There was hardly any political intent involved. Certainly you could say that perhaps religious purpose was involved. But that is what is different now from modern times. Mythology is now given the political purpose. And I should begin now with the race theory, which had early development because of the success of West European colonialism, and involved partly a belief in Christian superiority and partly a belief in racial superiority. That racial superiority was partly influenced and partly modified by the theory of Indo-European race. It being found in the late 18th century that several languages, Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, German, Germanic languages, including English, had many traits in common, which other languages like Chinese or Arabic did not share. And therefore arose the concept of Indo-European language family. And therefore a belief that if there was a common parent language, there must have been a common race of origin. For a particular subfamily of the Indo-European languages, the word Aryan was coined from the word Arya in Sanskrit, going back to early Sanskrit texts, and air in the Iranian. In both languages, the word did not mean race, it meant respectable people. You have the word Iran from there. And you have the word Arya for the twice born castes. That is to say, Shudras and the untouchables were not Aryas, they were not respectable. But in English usage, Aryan became an indication of race. It is purely European appropriation of Indo-European, of Aryan, relating only to the Indo-Iranic language speakers. But it was the Nazis, Hitler and his fellow Nazis, who made the Aryan word apply to Germans, who were in fact not Aryans at all. They belonged to the larger Indo-European family, the Germanic subfamily of Indo-European family. And even use swastika, though turning it in the direct direction, which they took from ancient, from Indian tradition. And therefore promoted the Aryan race theory, making Germany the original Aryan home. Now, it has happened that this theory has come back to us from Germany. And the present UGC syllabus announces that there were Aryans did not come from outside. India is the original home of the Aryans. as if we have made Arya a word specifying race, not respectability. And of course, excluding Shudras and so on. This is a very perverse development of mythology. Because to think that race has anything to do with human endeavors is really perverse and unnecessarily introduces into India a division between Aryans and Dravidians, which, by the way, genetically there doesn't seem to be. It's all linguistic. So to turn a language family into a genetic family, which geneticists reject, is perverse mythology and only promotes a false kind of national patriotism, which turns into a kind of racial patriotism. The second implication of this is, of course, that every great achievement must be related to Aryans. And therefore, it becomes very important for present propagandists of mythology that the Indus civilization should be denied to Dravidians or any other non-Aryan race. Now, this is, as far as historical facts are concerned, archaeology is concerned, extremely dubious procedure. Indus civilization is dated. Carbon dating and all other kinds of dating possible between 2600 BC and 1800 BC. And as far as the earliest Vedic ancient text Rig Veda is concerned, on linguistic grounds, particularly because of its very close kinship with the Avesta, the Iranian text, which could be keyed to with Mesopotamian chronology. It is just impossible to date the Rig Veda before 1500 BC. There are other indications also that Indus civilization is earlier than Rig Veda, because Indus civilization, for instance, doesn't have a horse. It is only, all other remains can be attributed to wild horses, which are very few. And there is no horse portrayed on the seals, in the seals, in spite of the numerous animals otherwise represented. So it's a pre-horse civilization. Its dating also is pre-Vedic. Now all this is brushed aside. And Indus civilization is being called Saraswati Sindhu civilization. Previously, the official name was Harappan civilization in India, Indian archaeological survey. But now I see that officially it is increasingly become Saraswati Sindhu or Sindhu Saraswati civilization. As if, because Saraswati and Sindhu are mentioned in the Rig Veda by those names, by the very name, you can convert Indus civilization into an Aryan one. This is particularly perverse because if there is any association with any Indian language, it is with the Proto-Dravidian because of the profusion of the fish signs and the position of the arrow signs in the industries. These two important indicators suggest a Proto-Dravidian affiliation. But as I've said, the particular perversity lies in seeing Indian past culture as essentially an Aryan culture, and therefore rejecting the Dravidian contribution to our culture. Apart from this kind of racialism, which is totally opposed to all serious historiography, and I'm sure that myth makers in other cultures would probably take care to eschew this kind of racialism, particularly because of the Nazi experience. Apart from that, there is another construction of mythology, and that is about both the chronology and the cultural achievements and scientific achievements of early Aryan, so-called Aryan civilization, apart from this appropriation or misappropriation of Indus culture. When the present Prime Minister had won the earlier elections, very soon after his taking office, he informed the Indian public that we in ancient India knew plastic surgery in distant past because of what we did to Lord Ganesha, fitting an elephant's head into a human body. It mattered that such a fantastic statement should be made by the Prime Minister of the second most populous country in the world. But ever since then, all kinds of perverse claims have been made. If you look at very past issues of the journal history, Indian History of Science, Indian Journal of History of Science, you will see all kinds of articles trying to establish the dates of the Rig Veda at 8000 BC or other texts, earlier time Brahmanas and Upanishads, very early times, to all kinds of contrived astronomical dating, and then attributing all kinds of scientific achievements to texts that were dated earlier so as to be earlier than other texts throughout the world. B.B. Lal, who was once Director General of Archaeology, I remember him declaring that that Shatapatha Brahmana was to be dated 4400 BC, just because of a particular reference to an astronomical situation, and so on. Vatankar, the RSS archaeologist, also insisted that Rig Veda was as old as 8000 BC. So first there is this chronological fantasy, and then the achievements. As I've said, plastic surgery, astronomical achievements, by just dating everything early, the text as early as possible. And where texts are not available, interpreting particular passages and then dating them early. So this kind of thing has proceeded to a considerable extent. And when the textbooks of ancient India by Makhan Lal was published during the earlier RSS, the BJP regime, 1999 to 2004, then all dates were pushed to 5000 BC. Rig Veda was put, if I remember right, in 5000 BC, and so Indus civilization was made into a Vedic civilization, although Rig Veda has no perception of tongues. It is this kind of mythology that has led to the acceptance in the UGC syllabus of the Ramayana and Mahabharata as historical texts. There is an actual statement there in the syllabus that the historicity of the epics has to be studied. And then, of course, flying chariots would make us the first inventors of the aeroplane. DC Sarkar, I trust he was putting it as a joke, said in his text of Ramayana that after all, flying chariots were invented not by Aryas but by Rakshasas. So we can hardly claim flying chariots as an Aryan discovery. But by making Ramayana and Mahabharata as historical texts, we are actually creating another source of mythology and trying to turn it into history. This kind of myth-making continues also into medieval India. There's, for instance, a depreciation of Buddhism and Prakrit, and a particular play with the caste system. First of all, the entire business of the rise of castes and its influence on society is brushed under the carpet in the UGC syllabus. There is no reference to the caste system in ancient India. The first reference to caste system comes under medieval India, as if it was the inclusion of the Muslims, which forced Hindus to adopt the caste system. I wonder if this argument would be good. The history of so important a social organization and its spread is a very important element of ancient Indian history. Where did the caste system arise? The Jati system, the endogamy, the detailed subcastes, their classification into 4 varnas. How did it start? How did it become? How did it assume all these details? From which regions did it spread? Particularly the endogamy system, the system of outcasts, the class of outcasts, the transfer of the majority of people from the Varna of Vaishyas to the Varna of Shudras. All these are very important questions. And much has been written on it. R.S. Sharma's classic Shabdas in ancient India, for instance. And there are many questions also. Why does the caste not appear in Ashoka's Dharma? Why is there no reference at all to the caste system or the following the caste system? What was the role of Buddhism? Does Buddhism, by insistence on transmigration of souls, which in the Upanishads is attributed to Kshatriyas and therefore by inference to Mahavira and Gautama Buddha, where it provided a new justification for the Varna system, caste system. All these are very important elements of ancient Indian history. And these are totally ignored in the UGC. And therefore, you might put statues of Ambedkar, but actually you are driving out Ambedkar from ancient Indian history by creating a false kind of history of Indian society. There's a very interesting, but I think perverse interest in the origins of the Rajputs. I think it's an interesting question. How did the term Rajputra originate? But Rajputs are now sought to be viewed as the great defenders of Hinduism. And therefore, how they originated becomes very important for Indian historiography, if you can see from the UGC syllabus. Professor Dashrath Sharma had long ago argued that Rajputs were actually Brahmins who, because the Kshatriyas had failed to fight the Muslims, turned into Rajputs themselves, into Kshatriyas themselves, and therefore became Rajputs. So Professor Dashrath Sharma was a serious historian. Very few historians treated this as serious argument. But it is now very clear, I think, from a particular influence in a record of Arab conquest of Sindh, 712, in which the cavalry, 4,000 or 5,000 cavalry surrounding Dahar, the Sindh ruler, and the final battle, are described as Ibn al-Muluk, an Arabic translation exactly of Rajput. So these were cavalrymen, lancers riding horses, which had replaced increasingly the chariots. By Harsha's time, the chariots had disappeared and the cavalry had come. So Rajaputras were actually the new cavalry soldiers, and they are gradually found all over northern India and partly in the Deccan. And their castes and subcastes develop over time. But they are essentially horsemen. And there were also other castes. Gurjaras, for instance, the rulers were Gurjaras, and ordinary peasants were also Gurjaras. They had a large empire in northern India. So there were others also who were important, not only Rajaputras. But as I say, there is a special position being attributed to the Rajaputras, and in the UG syllabus, that particular period of say 700 to 1200 is given as much importance as the further period from 1200 to 1700, the so-called Muslim period. Now, I shall come now to the next myth making, which again is fairly old, both from the side of Muslim communalism and Hindu communalism, as if the period of 1200 to 1700, most rulers were Muslims, was a period of foreign rule, or Muslim rule, as if all Muslims belong to the ruling class. Now, first of all, it is true that Islam came from outside, or previous religious systems in India, Brahmanism, Buddhism, Jainism, that arisen out of India. Islam came from Arabia. But apart from Sindh, Arabs did not come to India. Those who came to India first from abroad were from Iran and from Central Asia, after the initial Arab rule in Sindh, which was established very simple. And they settled in India, and then of course there were large numbers of conversions, so that most Muslims, of course, have the same genetic character as their Hindu Hindu compatriots. Genetically, no particular difference has been established between Muslims and Hindus, so far as I know. A judge of the Allahabad High Court, delivering a long judgment on the Babri Masjid case, told us that Indian Muslim rulers sent Indian wealth abroad all the time. I don't know where Justice Sudhir Agarwal studied history, but I don't remember any case of any Indian Muslim ruler sending large amount of wealth abroad to his compatriots, except of course certain charitable grants made for Hajj pilgrims, and that also to Indians going for Hajj. This is a confusion between wealth transfer that took place under British imperialism, often amounting to 4 or 5% of India's gross national income, which would be even more than what a backward society could produce additionally, apart from meeting its subsistence costs. Confusing that transfer of wealth, which Darabhai Nauroji and other early Indian nationalists spoke, and which further research has even enlarged on what they have said. Confusing this with Muslim rulers who might in origin have come from Central Asia, and some of them didn't. For instance, Khaljis belong to Afghanistan and had little to do with, and Afghanistan was often regarded as actually part of India. Abul Fazl said Kabul and Kandahar are the gateways of India. So, given this particular position, to treat Afghanistan as a Afghan area is now, of course, a separate country, but at that time it was hardly so regarded. And then again, they didn't go back. They never sent any money back, and so on. Take the Mughals. After Humayun, every Mughal emperor was born in India. And from Akbar onwards, they sent no tribute abroad. They employed Indians, both Muslims and Rajputs, and also descendants of foreign migrants. And therefore, to call them foreigners, as our Prime Minister did immediately after taking office, talking of 1,000 years of foreign rule, is absurd. Whatever they gained, sultans or rajas, from the poor in India, by taxation, from the peasants, and because of India from taxation, they spent within India. And therefore, to that extent, not only exploited India, but also promoted its economy. As everyone did. And if you look at histories of other countries like England, Normans were actually French, Angevins were French, and even their present dynasty is of Germanic origin. Can you say therefore that England has been ruled by foreigners all the time? So this kind of application of modern national boundaries to pre-modern history is absurd. Colonialism is different. It is a real extraction of economic wealth from the colony to the metropolitan country, which did not occur in earlier politics. And this kind of denunciation leads to absurdities. I will give one example. Curzon says in his reminiscences once that once he was visited by Mr. Surendranath Banerjee when he was viceroy. And Surendranath Banerjee asked him to do something which he doesn't mention, but some administrative measure or some concession to some friend of Banerjee, which Curzon immediately did. And so Surendranath Banerjee was very pleased and said to Curzon that after Ashoka and Akbar, you are the best ruler. And Curzon was very pleased with the comparison between Ashoka and Akbar. There was this kind of feeling that these were the two rulers who left something behind, some particular principle or moral principle behind. But today, in the UGC syllabus, Akbar is excluded from the syllabus. He's not worth even mentioning. And by the way, Ashok is only just mentioned Ashok. There is no description in the UGC syllabus of the fact that he brought writing for the first time to the country, Northern India at least. And of course, no mention that Tamil Brahmi and early Brahmi script has been found in South India and Sri Lanka earlier. So even the importance of writing is forgotten because then it would be attributed to Ashoka and Buddhism. But coming back to Akbar, Akbar is excluded totally. And therefore, the culture of the time, the architecture of the time, even the technological developments of the time are all excluded. So exclusion is also a part of mythology. They are not parts of history at all. The fact that spinning wheel came into medieval India in the 14th century, Charkha, the symbol of India's national movement, is not even worth mentioning. So all aspects of modern, what is regarded modern historiography as essential, women's history, technology, social structure, and so forth, are as far as ancient India is concerned, excluded. As far as medieval India is concerned, it is assumed that caste system came for the first time in medieval India under the Muslims. As for example, it was said, used to be said that Sati came because of the Muslims, although now in Sati inscriptions have been found much earlier. And in fact, in the Mughal Empire, Sati was restricted. Then you have mythology being built for modern India, which I will, because I've taken so much time, I will be brief about that, which is to put both Gandhiji and Jawaharlal Nehru in the shade, to put the main national movement in the shade, and to try to make V.D. Savarkar as a great national figure. Despite what he did from 1920 onwards, his total abstention from any criticism of British, his declaration that monumental reforms were end, and his declaration of Hindutva, making Muslims the main enemy, not the English. His two-nation theory, perversely preceding the Lahore resolution of the Muslim League. Despite this, he's promoted as the great nationalist. And continuous effort is made to run down the great national figures and to misinterpret Patel. If misinterpreting Indian history, giving wrong facts and wrong emphasis is not only distortion of history, but in my view, this is also myth building, creating heroes or denouncing heroic figures, on the other hand, for your own political benefit today, partisan benefit. So the whole history of the national movement is sought to be misinterpreted. And our national leaders, who belong mainly to the Congress, and even when they were socialists or communists, they belonged to the Congress in the 1930s and early 40s. They are being ruled out of history. They are nowhere in the picture. And Sardar Patel glorified, despite the fact that he personally wholly rejected the idea of a Hindu state in his correspondence with G.D. Bill. He clearly stigmatized the RSS for its crimes against Muslims. And therefore, totally misrepresenting historical figures for their own political advantage. And this kind of myth building has continued till for the period after 47. Umpteen speakers today speak as if nothing happened after 47. And only now something is being done. And unfortunately, if these facts are not recited, people will believe in this myth. I want to recall the Constitution, the very fact of adult suffrage, the very first step after independence. Our democracy was established. Our parliamentary democracy was established. Nobody believed that immediately an adult suffrage all over India would be possible. That was shown and done in 1952. Secondly, much is said about civil code and reform. Well, Hindu civil code was totally reformed in 1955-56 and subsequently Dowry Act. And then in which for all matters practically women were made equal to men in inheritance and so on. And in Hindu joint family, this measure was also taken in 1900 to 2005, not under a BJP government, but under a non-BJP government. And then abolition of landlordism, zamindari throughout the country, and land reform, which today, if the peasants have lands, all of this they got after independence. Lumbi Zamindari Abolition Act and so on, and the most radical acts in Kerala and West Bengal legislation later on. And then land sealing, by which the so-called untouchables got land, the Dalits got land. All that took place after independence. The construction of heavy industry in India, particularly under second five-year plan, which I would like to remind G.D. Birla lauded. All this construction of heavy industry belongs to that period, and then of course institutes of technology and so on. And the policy of independence and non-alignment, all was the creation of that period. So myth building also involves deletion of history. And that we see in the case of national movement and the case of post-independent India. It is therefore the task of historians not only to whitewash everything, but to present the actual facts, both the weaknesses of the past and the achievements of the past, both on an accurate basis and a larger scope of history, as I've said, that we have now established, and probably the scope will become larger and larger as fresh generations. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable words. Now, I guess the question answer session is open for everyone. You can type it in the chat box itself, or you can raise your hands. Sir, you can ask your question.
राजीव, you can ask your question.
सर मेरे दो सवाल हैं छोटे छोटे. पहली चीज सर कि आपने एक टर्म यूज किया आरएसएस आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट वाकड़कर सर के लिए, जिन्होंने भीमबेटका को खोजा। तो सर मैं आपसे ये जानना चाहता हूँ कि क्या आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट भी आरएसएस, कांग्रेस या मार्क्सिस्ट होते हैं, नंबर 1। नंबर 2, सर आपने एक बाबरी मॉस्क के लिए इलाहाबाद हाई कोर्ट का डिसीजन कोट किया जस्टिस सुधीर का, कि जो मोहम्मडन्स थे या मुस्लिम थे उस समय पर वो यहाँ से वेल्थ को बाहर लेके गए। तो सर मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है इस पर कि क्या इसकी क्रॉस चेकिंग के लिए हम या मैकेनिज्म के लिए क्या हमने कोई ऐसा उनसे प्रूफ मांगने की कोशिश करी, और अगर करी तो सर प्रूफ क्या दिया सर ने, नंबर 2। नंबर 3 सर कि आपने नेशनलिज्म मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री भी कवर किया, तो सर मैं ये जानना चाहता हूँ कि एक्चुअली आज के समय पर राष्ट्रवाद का आम जनमानस के लिए उपयोगिता क्या है, the relevance of the nationalism in today's world। सर ये 3 क्वेश्चन छोटे छोटे से मेरे।
पहला क्वेश्चन,
थैंक यू सो मच।
पहला क्वेश्चन क्या था?
क्या आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट भी आरएसएस, मार्क्सिस्ट या कांग्रेस ऐसे टाइप के आइडियोलॉजिकल होते हैं?
हाँ, जाहिर है कि हर सिटीजन होता है, वो चाहे आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट हो चाहे डॉक्टर हो, वोट तो देता ही है। तो आरएसएस के हो भी सकते हैं, वाकंकर तो खैर थे ही आरएसएस के, और उन्होंने काम अपना किया था। तो उनका ये कहना था कि ऋग्वेद 8000 BC की। अब घोड़ा उस वक्त हो ही नहीं था, तो आर्कियोलॉजी हो गई है। घोड़े की भी हमें मालूम है कि कब से घोड़ा डोमेस्टिकेट हुआ। रशियन स्टेप्स में, कजाकिस्तान स्टेप्स में हुआ था सबसे पहले 3000 BC के लगभग। तो 8000 BC तो नामुमकिन है। बहरहाल वाकंकर साहब यही कहते थे, और 5000 BC जो मक्खन लाल साहब ने दिया था वो भी नहीं हो सकता, क्योंकि 3000 BC से पहले घोड़ा कहीं डोमेस्टिकेट ही नहीं हुआ था, और घोड़े का तो बराबर जिक्र है इसमें ऋग्वेद में। तो ये बात थी। जहाँ तक सुधीर अग्रवाल का साहब है, वो तो उन्होंने जजमेंट में दिया था, उस पर आर्ग्यूमेंट क्या हो सकता है, ना वो केस में उनके सामने था, उससे कोई मतलब ही नहीं था बाबरी जजेस का। मैं सिर्फ ये कह रहा था कि उनके कहने से ये मालूम होता है कि बाद लोगों का ये ख्याल था, चाहे वो हाईकोर्ट जज हो, कि मिडिएवल इंडिया में दौलत बाहर भेजी जा रही थी, बस बाहर भेजी जा रही थी। इसलिए मैंने उनका कोट किया, क्योंकि हिस्टोरियंस जो हैं वो तो ऐसी मिथ को कमी करेंगे, क्योंकि कोई फैक्ट ही नहीं है। लेकिन सुधीर अग्रवाल साहब ने इसको अपने जजमेंट में बहुत बार, हालांकि ना एविडेंस में आया था, ना कोई इससे मतलब था कि। अब हाँ, तीसरा आपने क्या कहा था?
सर नेशनलिज्म का उपयोग क्या है आज के समय पर, रेलेवेंस ऑफ द नेशनलिज्म।
हर नेशनलिज्म वहाँ तक ठीक है जहाँ तक आप ये कहें कि भाई हमारे मुल्क में हम जहाँ रहते हैं वहाँ अपने देश में उसकी इकोनॉमिक लाइफ ठीक होना चाहिए, वहाँ सबके साथ जस्टिस होना चाहिए, सोशल जस्टिस होना चाहिए, ये सब सही है, ये नेशनलिज्म सही है। लेकिन दूसरी नेशंस को बुरा कहना या ये बनाना कि हम दूसरों से बहुत ही आगे हैं, बढ़िया हैं, ये तो शॉविनिज्म है, वो नेशनलिज्म नहीं। तो अंग्रेजी में 2 लफ्ज अच्छे हैं, नेशनलिज्म और शॉविनिज्म। तो शॉविनिस्ट नहीं होना चाहिए, और कभी भी वो तो नेशनलिज्म ये है कि अपने आप को धोखा नहीं देना चाहिए। तो जैसे बहुत से और मुल्क हैं वहाँ भी होता है। तुर्की में अक्सर ये कहा जाता है कि तुर्की सबसे पहले ज़बान हुई, ये हुआ वो हुआ, क्योंकि वो ग्रीस उनका नेबर है, ग्रीक उनका सिविलाइजेशन बहुत पुराना है। तो अक्सर तुर्क सरकारी उसमें भी बहुत सी क्लेम करते हैं, और यहाँ तक क्लेम करते हैं क्योंकि वो आजकल मुसलमान हैं कि इस्लाम के जो बेसिक टेनेट्स थे वो तुर्कों को पहले से मालूम थे, यहाँ तक क्लेम करते हैं। तो ये कोई हमारे यहाँ ही नहीं है कि हमारे यहाँ मिथ बिल्डिंग हो रही है, लेकिन जहाँ भी मिथ बिल्डिंग हो रही है वो गलत है, चाहे वो तुर्की हो चाहे हिंदुस्तान हो, और इस अपने मुल्क के लिए डेंजरस है, क्योंकि गलत बातें समझ में आती हैं कि दूसरे तो कुछ नहीं है और हम बहुत तीस मार्क हैं। इसलिए मिथ बिल्डिंग तो किसी आदमी के लिए भी कि अपने आप के लिए क्लेम करे जो उसने कभी नहीं किया, वो अगर एक देश भी क्लेम करता है तो वो भी गलत है, उसको नुकसान ही होगा। तो ट्रू नेशनलिज्म मिथ बिल्डिंग नहीं है। ट्रू नेशनलिज्म ये है कि भाई जो अपना हमारा पास्ट है असली उसे देखें, अननेसेसरीली आपस में झगड़ा न करें।
सर एक्चुअली मेरा क्वेश्चन ये था कि राष्ट्रवाद की उपयोगिता क्या है? राष्ट्रवाद से क्या रोजगार मिलेगा आम जनमानस की भाषा में अगर हम समझना चाहें?
राष्ट्रवाद अगर ये कहेगा कि हमारे यहाँ इंडस्ट्री होना चाहिए, हमारे यहाँ किसानों को ठीक से ट्रीटमेंट होना चाहिए, मार्केट कंट्रोल होना चाहिए, तो ठीक है, राष्ट्रवाद से फायदा होगा देश।
थैंक यू सर।
Next, Moon Chaudhary, you can ask your question.
Hello. Hello.
You can ask, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
तो मेरा इरफान सर से एक सवाल है, what should Indian Muslim do at present in this nationalistic atmosphere? What is the duty of the Indian Muslims?
नहीं, क्या मैं समझा नहीं। What is the question?
Sir, I am Moon Chaudhary from Guwahati, Assam.
Yes.
मैं जानना चाहता हूँ आपको, इस ये जो हाल है अभी, जो देश का जो नेशनलिस्टिक व्यू है, इसमें व्हाट इज द ड्यूटी ऑफ अस, हम लोगों को क्या करना चाहिए?
You see, any kind of myth building is not good for a person. It is not good for the country, because you are unnecessarily self-satisfied. You look down upon others, and of course, in our case, it is a part of the communal offensive also, which is bad for the country. Rationalism, reason, is always the best concept. And secularism in its real sense means that as far as religion is concerned, you don't allow it to interfere in government matters, any religion. And this is what secularism is about. Secularism doesn't mean simply toleration of all religions, but it means exclusion of religion from state and totally from government. This, of course, we are not doing. We are building up a myth which is very communal and religious in character. So that is bad for the country. The country should be wedded to reason, not prejudice and religion. Reason is the best counsel, and reason has to be secular. It cannot be influenced by religious beliefs of any kind or superstitions of any kind.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Shashwat, you can ask your next question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I am audible.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, as you mentioned that the origin of Rajputs are in that period. So when I read some medieval, pre-medieval times, sir, there is a mention of the Agni Kula Rajput, that the four Rajputs originated from that Agni at Mount Abu, like the Pratiharas, Chauhan, Solankis, and Parmar. So, sir, what is the source of this theory?
So this is very late. And actually, of course, nobody can originate from a sacrifice.
Yes,
so it is, Rig Veda says in the 10th book that all of us originated from the cause of Purusha, who was sacrificed by the gods. So this is that kind of theory. It has nothing to do with historiography. As I say, there was a great shift in military organization once the Raths or chariots were abandoned and cavalry horses were directly used because of the development of stirrup and iron shoe later, but stirrup was coming in. Not actually as early as 7th century, but later. So cavalry now became increasingly important, and according to the earliest reference we have, and that is in the Chachnama account of the Arab conquest of Sindh, that is 712. Rajput is the name of the cavalry soldier. Of course, it never meant prince. Normally, it should have meant prince, but it was by extension given to all cavalry soldiers.
So, thank you, sir. Next question, Nazia Rizvi.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Sir, you said that scope of history has been greatly enlarged by methodology because it helps in assessing the various kinds of facts. So, sir, can we use this methodology right from the beginning, right from primary and secondary education, so that it would help students to differentiate between what is myth and what is history? Can we implement historical methodology in primary and secondary classes as well in history? So, because when we study historical methodology, we study that only in masters as students.
But actually, I think at some level, say by the time one reaches high school, 9th, because most people will come out of high school. So in the history paper, something should be said about, and usually, if I remember right, my high school textbook, there used to be in the beginning a chapter on sources, what kind of sources. It should be extended to methodology also, because now sources are not only texts and archaeology, but other genetics and so on. All these are now involved in reconstructing our past. Archaeology is becoming more and more important, for instance. So I think some students should be introduced at a higher level. I think 9th and 10th classes would be the level at which you could introduce historical method to some degree.
Thank you, sir. Sir, our own sir has asked a question, Shakir Hussain. His question is, how did Muslim rulers react to caste system of India?
Well, actually, it is a misconception that Islam emphasizes equality. In all scholarly and theological texts that I have come across in medieval India, there is no mention of masavat or equality as an objective of morality. Not at all. Islam permitted slavery and concubinage, so there is no question of equality there. Muslims did not offer any criticism of the caste system anywhere. The main criticism of Hindus were that they were idol worshippers. That is all. The caste system is described. Like Al-Biruni is the only one who is slightly critical of caste system, but he's a scientist. He's not a religious figure. He studies the Rig Veda with the same detachment as he studies New Testament. He quotes New Testament. So he's a different figure altogether. And unfortunately, a figure like Al-Biruni is also wiped out of our UGC syllabus. Although Panekar in his history once made a very great statement that Al-Biruni marked a moment in world history. So, apart from him, there's no criticism by any Muslim writer on the caste system. Akbar criticizes sati, but he does not criticize the caste. And Akbar was, of course, not a practicing Muslim by the time he was also criticizing Muslims for their not allowing the daughter full share. So even that man didn't think caste system was a perverse system. So this thought that Muslims came here to spread equality and egalitarian ethics is totally mistaken.
Ria, take some questions from the chat box.
That's what I was reading. Yeah, so Manimukh Sharma has asked question. In India, we claim that we had amazing scientific and literary achievements, but we don't like to talk about external influence of inspirations. Like, for instance, the impact of Greeks on our architecture, on our science, on astronomy, and so on. On the contrary, we claim that it were the foreigners who got influenced by us. As a result, that there is very little. Just a second, sir. So the question is, okay, yeah, it's over here. Sorry. There is a very little appreciation for the external influence in popular history. How do we address this gap?
Well, actually, good histories naturally give credit to the Greeks, but there is a perverse feeling, you are right to refer to it, that Greeks were influenced in their philosophy by Upanishads. This is a total misconception. Actually, it was Darashuko's translation of the Upanishads from Persian into Persian, in which actually he translated gods as angels. That was translated into Latin and influenced European philosophy. So it was not actually the original Upanishads, but Darashuko's translation, which made Upanishads into monotheistic texts only, that for the first time influenced, or at least was one appreciation in Europe in the 18th century. Otherwise, there is no basis for the claim that any Greek philosophers were influenced by Indian texts. But our astronomy was certainly influenced by Greek texts. Our latitudes, longitudes, all that system in Sanskrit was based on the Greek system, which had come from Mesopotamia undoubtedly, but we got it from the Greeks. And as Al-Biruni says, the contribution of Yavanas was acknowledged in Indian Sanskrit texts.
Thank you, sir. Dr. S.M. Shah, you can ask your question, sir.
I can't hear.
So you're not audible.
Yeah, in between, you can read that question from Embassy of India at Tashkent. Manish Prabhat, he wrote something in chat box. He asked a question.
अभिषेक झा सर को अनम्यूट कर दो थोड़ा. Not able.
He is not muted. He's unmute. Sir, the next question is by Manish Prabhat from Embassy of India, Tashkent. So he is asking, sir, how did the Mughal dynasty came to be called Mughal? What is the origin and meaning of the word Mughal? How did the Mughals refer to themselves? And how did Central Asian rulers, Persian rulers, and Turkish rulers refer to the Mughals? Thanks.
But Mughals did not refer to themselves as Mughals. Mughal was the name given by Indians to them when Babur came here, because they were now used to invaders coming from the northwest after Genghis Khan's campaign and then Hulagu's campaign in Afghanistan and their invasions during Alauddin Khilji's time. So Tamur was also called a Mughal by Indians. And when Babur established his kingdom here, then for a long time, the Indians continued to call the Mughal, the emperors, Tamurid emperors, Babur's descendants as Mughal. Even in Persian texts, for instance, famous Tarikh-e-Firishta, the word Mughal is used. So Mughal was the Indian word for the Tamurids, and that has come into use.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Hope I am audible.
Yes.
Sir, my question to you is, sir, as it is common to depict medieval period of Indian history as a Muslim period, so sir, my question to you is, what should be the preferable way to perceive medieval India? Was it a period of domination of one culture by other, or a period of shared identity in every sense? And my other question to you is, sir, since it was a matter of your historical analysis, I was eager to ask you this question. How do you find the condition of common masses in pre-colonial India different from colonial period?
But actually, your question is a very broad, wide one. But first of all, there were probably some technological and other reasons why Muslim armies, Muslim cavalry prevailed over its opponents in India. Iron stirrup and so on, all that is being studied. Partly also because of their more centralized organization, which up till the end of the 17th century gave them an advantage over opponents more traditionally organized, that is. And then by their incorporation of Rajputs practically into the Mughal nobility. That was, of course, a great advantage from Akbar onwards. As far as their relationship with colonial times is concerned, you see, let us just study one particular aspect. Both took large amount of land revenue from the peasant, both. In fact, the British inherited the land revenue system of the earlier years. Unfortunately, we don't have those details for, say, ancient Indian rulers. So we actually, most of them took more than 1/6, but we don't know. As far as Mughal times are concerned, our knowledge is extremely detailed. So we know that the British took over the land revenue system from the Mughals, and so in many ways, their tendency to have the land tax as a tax on land rather than on the tax on crops made things difficult for the peasants. that how more difficult than in the earlier period, it is very difficult to. It is almost impossible to know. But certainly in both times, the land rent was equally pressing on the peasant, whether it was the zamindari system or the rajwari system. Now you come to the other fact, what happened to the money, to the wealth that the English got. As far as the Mughals were concerned, they spent in India whatever wealth they had. So naturally they had large towns and crafts and so on, because there was no wealth transfer to any other country. The difference was that in England there is a large amount of wealth transfer, which, as we can see now, by middle 19th century was about 4% of India's gross national product. And that means that almost everything additional that India produced, apart from basic subsistence, went to England. That you can see by the Indian export and import imbalances, which did not occur in the Mughal times. The result of this was, of course, an increasing impoverishment. Of course, the impoverishment was there also when the Mughals took so much land revenue, but they then transferred it to towns where livelihood was provided. But in the English case, it went out of the country. So there was almost a de-urbanization or very stable urban economy not expanding. So this was the major difference, as the nationalist critics pointed out very early, Dadabhai Naoroji and others, that the earlier states in India kept the wealth of India within India, whereas the English were transferring it.
Sir, you can ask your question now.
I can't hear Dr. Jhan.
सर आप अपने सिस्टम का वॉल्यूम बढ़ाइए, फिर वो आवाज आएगी.
वोल्टेज बढ़ाइए.
In the meantime, you can take questions from chat box.
Yes, sir. So Niladri Adhikari has asked this question. As students of history, we often see that economic history and Marxist interpretations are often sidelined by saying personal opinion, whereas the cultural history, which can be easily glamourized, has more acceptability. How can we tackle this situation?
Well, actually, economic history need not be Marxist. It may be Marxist. Many facts about economic history are facts of statistics, like per capita income, distribution of income, GDP calculation, and so on. And on those facts, you can have various interpretations, which may be Marxist or non-Marxist. The same cases of culture. What weight you are giving to something like music, which, for instance, Mughal India, you can't hear what the musicians sang at that time, but you can read what the historian said, you can read what the theologian said, you can read what the storyteller wrote. So unfortunately, there are elements of culture which today we can't appreciate. Whatever was in written form, we can get. And then whatever was left in material form, like art, paintings, and architecture. And these need to be studied. Again, you will particularly find that in the UGC syllabus, there is very little about art and architecture or culture of the medieval period or even about the ancient period. And the student doesn't learn what was the difference between the various construction styles, the trabeate structure and the arcuate structure and so on. All this is Greek. So it is very important in Indian history to introduce aspects of art and architecture and technology and also philosophical thought. Very few people learn how Shankaracharya ultimately affected Indian or Hindu philosophy, Brahmanical philosophy from his 9th century pantheism. Actually, it is only in 17th century, early 17th century that pantheism really gained ground in Hindu thought. It took so much time. So there are various elements of even religious thought which are often ignored. And very interesting thing is whether the Islamic pantheism of Ibn Arabi, which was popularized in Akbar's time, helped to push Shankaracharya because Akbar was not actually aware of Shankaracharya's thought as Jahangir was. So whether Shankaracharya's thought was popularized because many Hindus also knew Persian, so they could have access to Ibn Arabi's philosophy, and then they saw the same thing in Shankaracharya. Although Shankaracharya is of course earlier. So these are very interesting problems which the study of cultural history brings out. Problems of religious thought, problem of religious exchanges, problem of religious myth, if you are talking about mythology.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Ashutosh Kumar, sir. Where and how do you situate the myth building about Rajputs in the Mrekhian and other such literature in medieval India?
I beg your pardon, I didn't catch it properly.
Yes, sir, I can repeat the question. Where and how do you situate the myth building about Rajputs in the Mrekhian and other such literature in medieval India?
Well, I'm not actually an expert on that, so I will not be able to answer how Rajput literature about Rajputs, practically in early Rajasthani, how much it has survived and how much weight should be granted to these traditions.
Ajit, you can ask your question.
Leah, bind up the session. Actually, he's still not asked, I think.
Last question for the day, I guess.
Sir.
You're audible, Ajit.
Sir.
Will not ask, bind up.
Okay, then. I would like to invite Mrs. Suvrita Khatri to please give us a vote of thanks. Ma'am.
Hello, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay. I don't know where to begin and how to begin thanking Professor Irfan Habib. It's been a great honor to have you here, sir. And I was just I was looking at the kind of questions that were coming. There were questions from teachers, but there were so many questions from students and so much eagerness to, there is what your lecture, I think, led towards. In a way, it ignited a curiosity, a way of understanding. I was deeply, let me read out one or two questions that struck me, and it says a lot about your lecture, sir. When I think it was Nazia who said, historical methodology should be taught to us in primary and secondary schools also. I think it just led to it, the students trying to understand what does our discipline of history teach us, how do we understand our own discipline, our past, and your lecture has gone a long way in making students, us, understand the difference between, or trying to situate mythology, its importance is there, but as a professional historian, how to understand our past. I really think that the students will have learned a lot from this. I'm also remembering something else today. When some historian who is 90 plus addressing you of your stature, Professor Habib's stature, there is a lot to say that one can. And my mind just went back to the time when I had finished my MA and just started teaching. And we had gone through all the debates at that time on medieval history, modern Indian history. And I had been telling my students that they must go. There was a lecture that you were to give in Delhi University. And as I took my students, we suddenly saw that there were busloads coming. And I think it was IP College, if I'm not mistaken, yes. And, general thing was that there is a great festival, a great singer is coming. People are talking, the traffic police guy is saying, ki yahan to koi bahut bada singer aa raha hai, itni buses aa rahi hain. It was you who were coming to speak, sir. And there were so many students who were eager to listen to you then and listen to you now. There is a lot that we could discuss about, but I think for us to be able to carry out our professional understanding of our subject with dignity and with equanimity, that is something that we have to and we must learn from you, sir. A very big thanks to you. I also want to take this opportunity to thank, we are very honored to have Professor Shireen Musvi amongst us, the great historian of Mughal India, and we are very honored that you are part of this gathering. As I move on to thank my department, my dear students, our principal who has allowed for a very free exchange of ideas, has created an environment where we can easily discuss and debate things. Our very big thanks to you. And as I end, after thanking my students, I do want to say that a Zoom lecture is not the setting, but I do want to end by remembering Professor Bhairavi Sahu, our very dear colleague, teacher, eminent historian, whom the history department and the community of historians lost recently. But on this note, I would just like to end this lecture today. And once again, Professor Habib, a big thank you to you.
Thank you very much for your kind words.
I request my colleagues to turn on your cameras for a photograph session with Professor Habib. All the faculty are requested to turn on your cameras, please. Is it done?
Yeah, done, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. Bye.
The next series of Origin Edition will be held on 11th by Professor Nayanjot Lahiri. She'll be speaking on Ashoka History and Memory at 11:30 a.m. on 11th. We'll once again be meeting on Zoom platform only. We'll share the links shortly. Thank you very much. Thanks again.